Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for staying with us. Thank you, Mr. Hoffman from DGB. Making digital capitalism humane, being courageous when it comes to changes. This is what the president of the German Confederation of Trade Unions says. And this will also be discussed during the second forum. Not only humane, but also an ecological face of the digital world. This will be the title, The Value of Public Goods in the Digital World. And you can join the discussion in about 35-40 minutes, because then your questions from Twitter under the hashtag DigiCap can be read by my colleague Geraldine Bastien, who's already waiting to receive your questions. But first we will talk about what public goods actually are and how something could become a digital infrastructure. Who controls the data traces in the cloud? Who controls the marketplace at Amazon if retailers can only sell there? And what about the old economy, that is the automotive industry and the household appliances industry connected with the cloud infrastructures of Amazon and company? Of course, the pandemic is a driver in the digital land occupation. The platforms are the only entities that actually grow and determine the infrastructures that we did not consider digital ones in the past, on private ones or public ones, when it's about mobility, health, administration, or education. This is what we will talk about in the next hour. Is there also withdrawal of political power? What is different in Germany, in Europe, compared to the US and China? What's happening there, and what has to happen so digitalization doesn't only create no problems, but also resolves problems such as the problem of sustainability? Where are the lines between civil society and public influence? What is how can the discrepancies between commercial and public goods be overcome? What does it look like in practice? We have Philipp Staab here. He is a professor of sociology of the future of work at Humboldt University and the Einstein Center Digital Future. With the sociologist Heinz Bude, he talked about inequality and injustice in Hamburg and Kassel. His first monograph is entitled Digital Capitalism, Market and Power in the Economy of Unscarcity. Inequality, digital capitalism, and research about tech giants such as Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, but also Alibaba and Tencent in China. They are the perfect candidates for this panel. So welcome, Philipp Staab. Now, on the other side, we have Tilman Santarius. He's a professor of social, ecologic transformation and sustainable digitalization at the Technical University here in Berlin. And he also works in the Einstein Center Digital Future in Berlin. He has been the head of the research group Digitalization and Socio-Ecological Transformation since 2016. And he's also working for the IOW. And he also works on the interfaces between digital and ecological transformation and NGOs. And you can also read this in his book that was recently even published in English. I only know the German title, Smart Green World, Digitalization Between Surveillance, Consumption, and Sustainability. He wrote this book together with Stefan Lange. So welcome, Tilman Santarius. Thank you both for coming. With Shoshana Zuboff, we talked about the U.S.-American situation, Proposition 22 in California, for example, where workers are prevented from concluding fair contracts. We talked about social media, etc. So in the first round, Mr. Santarius, could you answer the question whether everything is different in Europe? Well, a lot of things are different in Europe, and that's a good thing. But a lot of developments go in the direction we already witness in the United States. I would like to mention another example because, Tobias, you said I should also look at the interface with ecology. Climate change and skepticism towards climate change is widespread in the United States, and social media platforms have contributed to climate skepticism becoming more dominant. And here, groups like the AfD can use this for their climate skepticism and spreading it. And this is of great concern for me because I do not want this development here in Germany and in Europe, like in the US, that reasonable climate policies are impossible. Philipp Staab, what about your opinion when it comes to the differences between the US and Europe? Well, first of all, I see the difference from a very academic angle. If you look at the political economics of capitalism or digital capitalism, you always have communalities, which are important, but then you talk about the so-called varieties of capitalism, and they exist, definitely. But at the moment, particularly, when we talk about digital infrastructures as critical infrastructures and public goods, we see that there is a European version of digital capitalism, but it is just developing. So there is a process where the political class or the political and economic elites in Europe try to create this system, but they always depend on the question, what is European? Going beyond industrial policy promoting European businesses. The answer is very obvious. It is a situation where rights and public goods should be discussed in a European transition. And that is why I'm less pessimistic than a lot of other critical observers in the field. I believe that many processes that take place on the European level and in Germany should be understood as an attempt of coming to terms with a European model by discussing public goods from a fresh angle. Well, talking about rights, we shouldn't talk about the right wingers, that is. So the discussion is also, what are public goods in the digital world? What has to be fulfilled so we can call something a digital infrastructure, because it's not just an infrastructure that's offered digitally. Well, you want to talk about relevance, so we should say critical infrastructures. We should discuss critical infrastructures first. And these are infrastructures that guarantee the functioning of the system. They are relevant for the system. If they fail, the rest will not work either. And then we have a bridge between public goods that is a very empirical one. That is, on the one hand, more and more critical digital infrastructure is dominated by a small number of very large companies in digital capitalism, the usual suspects, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, etc. And then on the other hand, we have a development where these companies, and you don't see it so much in Germany, but you see it in the UK and in China and the US, that these companies at the same time are pioneers when it comes to land occupation among public goods. Mr. Santarius, these are also processes we're discussing. So an infrastructure is not something natural. It is developed, and digital infrastructures are also being developed. So the control of tech companies of the infrastructure is not a natural process. They acquire that process. So before the pandemic or during the pandemic, what processes are accelerating processes where you, as a research expert in sustainability, can say, well, it went quite well because we saved CO2. So let me briefly ask the question about CO2 and the co-benefits of the pandemic. I believe that the digital infrastructure that can be divided up into soft infrastructures, software, search engines, social media platforms, etc., and hard digital infrastructures such as data centers, the submarine lines, etc., and the switching stations. I would like to distinguish between the two. And there is a concerning development that already took place before the pandemic, because the hard digital infrastructures in a classic sense, or the majority of them, were publicly owned or were owned by a private company with a clear public mandate, like in telecommunications. Now that process reversed. If you look at the submarine cables in 2020, for the first time we have a situation where more than half of the capacity of cables around the world, and that is the cloud. The cloud is not up in the sky. The data is in the computer centers and in the submarine cables. And they are in the hand of companies, 4 companies that are content providers: Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. So this is, of course, in conflict with net neutrality. If the content providers are also the providers and operators of the digital infrastructure. So here we have to be cautious, and our politicians slept through the process. They had to decide whether to turn this into a public process or a process under good conditions for the common weal. Can I briefly distinguish between public goods and private goods? Because that was a question directed to Philipp before. But don't forget the ecology, because you promised me that. Well, I would like to briefly come back to our manual, page 1. Public goods are non-exclusive goods in consumption, non-rivaling goods. For example, if you go to a museum, everyone can look at the picture, nobody can take it away from another person. And in a search engine like Google or in a social media platform, these conditions are fulfilled. If you click that you agree to the terms and conditions, you can participate. But another distinguishing factor between public and private goods is that public goods should generate positive external effects. They should promote the common weal going beyond individual benefits. So Google does not only answer my questions, but it structures the knowledge of humankind. Or in a museum or in historical buildings, supra-individual values are preserved. So digital public goods could have positive external effects that are overlapped by a lot of negative external effects that have an influence on the positive effects. So these seemingly public goods like search engines of Google or social media platforms cannot consider themselves public goods. The negative aspects are, of course, data privacy aspects, etc. But I would like to ask the question, are these public goods or are these public bads? Because they cause a lot of negative effects for the common weal. Well, all these are processes that you mentioned, Mr. Staab, that did not arise during the pandemic. They are slightly older when it comes to digital infrastructures, for example. And we will talk about alternatives on a European level when we talk about policies and political influence. But let's look back for a minute. Where do you think has the pandemic aggravated the problem? Because this was a classic privatization problem, that common goods have been privatized, as in capitalism before, at least in the Anglo-Saxon sphere, because all these processes went in that direction as well. But what happened specifically in the digital infrastructures aggravated by the pandemic? Well, I would like to answer your second question first. Is that classic privatization as we know it from neoliberalism? Well, it exists too in the digital sphere, and we might have to discuss it, because I believe the perspective that the state or the government should do everything, independent of whether you think that's desirable or not. The question is whether that is a realistic option doesn't even arise. But the question that does arise is how an increasingly digital public sector can secure its political primacy, so that in the classic PPPs offered by the digital companies, we cannot secure it. This is one question. The other question is, are these classic privatization processes, or is this not the development of alternative structures? If they become a hegemony, they are no longer private. Well, it's not a classic privatization. It's a private business alternative that absorbs public goods. A good example that was mentioned is how I characterize public transport at the moment. What happens with respect to digitalization, what's relevant when it comes to the distribution of power and dependencies, is the development of meta platforms. The most important one, the most successful one, is probably Google Maps. People in Berlin who try to find their itinerary through the city, they go to the Google Maps website, and then they see the public transport box that they can click on, because our public transport system collaborates with Google, and at the same time they get additional means of transport, for example, e-scooters or Uber taxis or Free Now taxis, the German alternative to Uber, because they will probably be taken over by Uber soon. So what's happening there is simply that the management of shared public mobility in the city, behind people's back and behind the public sector's back, are being privatized. You don't really need a partnership or a service provider relationship with the public transport system. The providers simply do it. And that is a huge difference. And now to come back to your first question, or the beginning of your question, this is something that started long before the pandemic. And what you can see during the pandemic, if you look at the investment processes in venture capital, for example, in the US, is that after a short slump, after the venture capital firms had to get used to home office work, it continued, particularly in health economics. There were massive increases in this sphere, which is also a sphere Google, Apple, and others had been eyeing for a long time, and they had launched applications that had simply failed before, but now it's also a sign that this becomes more important.
Noch bei der Mobilität.
Let's stick with mobility for a second before we go one step back and zoom in on sustainability once again, but maybe you will be able to address that. Let's stay with a local public transport company. It used to be a store corporation, but now BVG stands for Berliner Verkehrsbetriebe, which is the local public transport operator. This company forwards its data to Google Maps officially. So you can look at connections in local public transport by using Google and running a Google search that works. Is that a very good idea? What's your take on that? Or what should happen? Does the local public transport operator take over more data specialists, or is this some kind of cooperation which might lead to a situation where people use less of their own motorized cars? Because this is the largest public transport platform which is fully integrated. Is that a dilemma, or what would you do that if you wanted to promote sustainable approaches? Well, it's a web scraping of data which is not prohibited. So Google and anybody else can use the data, not only from the local public transport operator, but from companies worldwide. But it's only a one-way street. Google and others use the information from the app of the local transport company, but the local public transport company doesn't get any benefit out of using the data from the similar companies in Oslo, San Francisco, or elsewhere, or Sydney. You know, if you bring Google data together, and if you pool it there, you can process it much more effectively and efficiently. But there is no benefit in that for the local public transport operator. So this local public transport operator is only the supplier and Google is the collector of information, although the public transport operators need financial state support in order to be able to survive. And Google is one of the most richest companies the world over, so we need to take political action in this regard. Let me make a suggestion. I think here we need a data governance. It is not possible to say all the data is public. Google should make its data public. The local public and transport operator should make it public. No, but we need to introduce data trust or create it from afresh. We need trustees who take care of data controlled by the public, or else if they were organized in civil society structures as a foundation that have to be subjected to public mandates in order to act in the common good. And these data trusts can grant access. They can also share benefits. So maybe not only Google will benefit from this data, but others can share these benefits as well. And they can also introduce other conditions, such as contribution to a sustainable mobility transition. Thank you very much. May I come in on that? Yes, please do so. The local transport company is not really the point, but it's a very good point, a very good role model, because the situation is the following. It affects a lot of public companies, and it will affect even more in the future. Data governance is just one thing. The question is, how much can you do in this regard? The open data line, I can't really see how this can be subjected to political power and broken up. Public companies, how can they be publicly committed to sharing information and making it publicly available as far as possible? But we also have to think about ways and means, and this is what's also actually happening in the context of, at least that's what I hear from the discussions on the Digital Service Act, that we also want to make open data sources available for private persons in order to reach a better level of equality and a much more even and fair and just distribution of power. And this brings us back to the question that you just asked, Tilman. Here we're dealing with a field where, for political reasons, for example, in the transport transition, local public transport, of course, is beneficial instead of people using their cars all the time. In such cases, it is most important that those interfaces where control can be introduced, and this is what platforms are all about. There's nothing else to it, and this is where we need to ensure public control. So it's not in the interest of the public institutions and democratic self-administration of this city XYZ, because this is not only a topic that keeps us busy in Berlin, but if you are hollowed out from a private gatekeeper who has a much more far-reaching interest in the data that are accessible, that's not really the issue right now. But what you have to discuss at the political level, and this is also what's currently happening, is what you do with public platforms. I think if you ask me on a personal note, this is a question that applies to many more fields than those that we subdivide under public goods. You know, this also needs to include other things, many more things, such as, for example, obviously we're unhappy with this situation because in inner city areas, people move out because people buy more and more from Amazon. An association of German retailers, why can't this present itself as a cooperative of the private stakeholders in order to see to it that the private retailers can do what Amazon has been trying for many years but hasn't managed to achieve, and that is not at the moment but same-day delivery. So you use your bicycle careers and put them into the equation in order to see to it that an algorithm, if you look for it on a platform, it will not only show you the cheapest product but also the closest product to you. And then from the retail shop around the corner, these products can be delivered. These are more overarching strategies where the creation of the platform does not lead to the winner takes it all, but the stakeholders benefited most of it. Those who are affected also exert control and have a say. But you need to start that in the field of public goods. I'll be done in a minute, Mr. Müller. I just wanted to add that because this brings us back to Mr. Santarius' point. You know, you can say it quite easily, but when you look at the public platforms that do exist, then we end up with a completely different problem. And the problem is that these platforms normally are not capable of being controlled. The possibility that is offered to you by a platform to be controlled, fine. Can it be controlled by a public enterprise? No, probably by a private service provider who de facto has access to the data and therefore has the possibility to shape these new platforms. So we really have to do a lot in the public services and in the public authorities, first and foremost. And we need to make sure that people will be activated or new study courses will be introduced to make sure that the up-and-coming will be prepared for that. And this is data governance. Public alternatives in contrast to the private alternatives. Wherever this is socially relevant, this needs to be made possible. And this competence does not exist. That is really missing. Sounds very interesting. But it seems as if not much was going on. I would like to contradict you in the field of libraries, for example, or bookshops. There are a lot of things that have been going on and have been aggravated. You know, how can you do books in a network where it can be delivered? Because they're only allowed to open up for a couple of hours a day. So a lot has happened in this regard. And it was very nice of you to describe how more local platforms can be interconnected. And here the buzzword is interoperability. Can you switch back between different technologies? Can you force platforms such as WhatsApp to be connected to Signal, which is much more safe because it's much better encrypted, or Telegram? Can the platforms be forced to exchange information instead of forcing people to use only one? And these, of course, are political aspirations which are currently being discussed in the European Commission with the Digital Services Act. This is an act which is currently being drafted. I think the first draft will be submitted next month, in the middle of December, as far as I know, so it will take a while, but the aspirations do exist. This is only one area where a lot remains to be done. A lot of other things are on the list as well, but this is a very important buzzword: interoperability, interconnection between various different platforms without private economic interests. Is this a path to embark upon, where we can cut down on resources? It would make a lot of sense, and I'm very happy that at the political level discussions are currently going on. The proposal was made by civil society and the critical network users. Interoperability was always a big buzzword, and we need to reach harmonization, as was the case for emails or messenger services or social media platforms in general. I'm not a software programmer, and therefore I can't really tell you how sophisticated this might be for a company for Facebook, Instagram, and all the others. But every 1 or 2 or 3 years, new social media platforms are being developed, and they get a lot of users within a short space of time rather quickly. So I think it would not be a tremendous overburden to ask for such a standard, but I don't know whether this would automatically help us to save resources. I think this takes more. I think, as I just said before, if we introduce data governance, and Philipp Staab just said it's not only about data governance, but also about the establishment of platforms which can be tied to common goods, high mobility, e-mobility transition, or a reduction of CO2 emissions, that will all tie into that. But this cannot be observed at the current moment in time. Even when you look at the mobility or service platforms that exist right now, there is no ecological path that they embark upon. People can decide freely, and normally they do that for cost reasons or because they want to choose the quickest connection to get from A to B. But these systems can also help people systematically to nudge. The most ecological solution can be offered, and then if you want to find a solution which is cheaper but has a much poorer CO2 balance, then this can be tied in as one of the main prerequisites. I think the example of online trading at the local level is very good. Pfaffenhausen, for example, is a city which had already established such a system even before the pandemic. Other communities have done that also successfully in other communities. Local interconnections by using bicycle couriers have failed, but supporting such endeavors is really definitely helpful and will help us reduce CO2 emissions significantly. Now, we're talking about hybrid models, don't we, when we talk about state and public entities all the time. Just to say this very clearly, we're not talking about promoting state-run companies which so far were taken over by multinational giants. Let's give you two more examples in order to elaborate on this and look at the different options which are currently on the table. Let's start at the very top, data infrastructure. At the European level, we have the project which is called Gaia X, supported by Germany and France in particular. And now they try to promote the system as far as possible. It's a cloud infrastructure which does not make us any more dependent on cloud, Amazon services or others, but helps us introduce European independence. At least that is the claim. We want to restore some independence in the field of data management. Some German players are on board, such as Bosch or Siemens, who on the one hand want to make use of their technology and add that to the system, but they also want to benefit from the system. So this is a conventional example where policymakers join forces with large corporations. Is this just as unique as we might think it is at the European level, and does this model take us into the right direction? Philipp Staab? I think Tilman gave us an answer to that one already. I think first and foremost we have to say that we are moving more and more away from the question of public common goods when we talk about such systems. We are not that really far away from, well, is that neoliberalism, yes or no? This question will not help us gain more ground. But what's currently happening, and this is how I read Gaia X, is that this is a neoliberal market design. So we have a cloud market which has been monopolized or oligopolized, depending on the way you look at it. And what we try to achieve with Gaia X is that we try to introduce rules of the game to ensure that interoperability between different service providers of infrastructure and cloud infrastructure can become possible. So you can switch back and forth as a user. You won't have lock-in effects such as in the public administration in Germany. You use Microsoft no matter what happens. That is a trend that we welcome very much. But let me put it into the right time trajectory in order to explain to you what's going on in this regard and in order to tell you which options might derive from that. What is happening in the following. In a post-neoliberal time that we are living in, where you are no longer religious and try to commit yourself to certain dogmas, we still use the instruments of shaping the market. At the same time, digital platforms, in particular, leading the digital capitalism, have established privatized markets. Platforms are nothing but control and governance structures, design structures for markets. And they discover now, and this is what you can see when you look at Gaia X, without the people who developed it being fully aware of it, that this is also a new type of a political or multi-stakeholder-based way of giving shape to the market. Becoming aware of that really helps you to see that the digital infrastructure is a critical infrastructure that we're talking about. And then the way, as just described by Tilman, from an Airbus, as Peter Altmaier put it, the Airbus for cloud computing leading all the way up to an Airbus for e-commerce and retail is not all that far. I think it's a big problem that you only have local experiments with these retail platforms, but you can also think big. But then you, of course, have to invest a lot of money. But why not do so? We can also do that in other areas. Let me just add to that very briefly. This is a kind of infrastructure because it might replace a road, the bad old metaphor of the digital highway and the data highway that we are no longer using. That wasn't wrong. But we want to use new ways of transportation and communication. We briefly spoke about education, we spoke about mobility. Before we look at the questions that came on via Twitter, let's talk about health for a second, because this is a very important topic, especially in Germany, but also in other parts of the world. Do we have the content tracing app? Well, I don't know whether it's a tracing app, but let's call it the Corona warning app. That's what it does. It sends us warning signals. Whether it was really helpful in recent months remains to be discussed. We are not yet certain about that. But we have a QR code maybe, and if you can do that and if you get a test, you might find out about it 2 days earlier. That was an example where the standard setup was turned upside down because all of a sudden private companies came along and they said, no, come on, dear state, there is not enough data protection in it. Let's do it differently. We've got a different model. Let's do it more decentralized in an anonymized way. we do it better than you can and better than you intended to do it. And then a cooperation was established with private companies, and which led to the fact that this Corona warn-app, and hopefully you all downloaded it onto your phone, need to be able to run on Apple Read and other platforms of this type. What happened in this context? Is this an example of best practices where we said, well, here things went really well in the democratic sense, where the companies embarked on a different path other than originally anticipated? Or is this a backdoor where they say, well, they can simply benefit from using these platforms?
I'm not a health expert, and I cannot say whether the warning app is working well in the broad term, but I'm happy that we have this decentralized data processing system with the warning app, and that it is not a tracking instrument, which might have been better for combating the pandemic, because you would have to have access to more research data. But here, the public good or the human right to freedom of movement and privacy was kept up and was not completely subsumed under other principles in times of crisis, where lots of things all of a sudden become possible and other things that for decades have been struggled for fall then through.
Apple mit dem App Store, Google mit dem Play Store gegenüber die Regierung durchgedrückt haben. Da lässt sich vielleicht trefflich drüber mutmaßen. Ich weiß nicht, ob ihr da noch mehr Informationen hat. Ich kann mir einfach auch vorstellen, dass sie gesehen haben,
Google and
dass diese
Apple
Daten
on the government, I don't know. Maybe you know it, but the data wouldn't become a company secret, and they had to share it with other companies, so it is less attractive than a proactive app that made them the sole company to track everyone's movement. This would have been in the interest of Google and would probably have fit their business model in a better way, because they do it now with the scooters. They want to use people's movement pattern rather than selling the scooters. A lot of people now actually want less data protection. They want to know where they might have been in contact with infected people. There is sort of a longing for surveillance in some groups of society. But what we saw with the warning app, is that a best practice, or why not? Well, if you think this is meaningful, it makes sense, and we could have put a question mark here just as an aside. But if you consider it meaningful, then it is an outcome-oriented approach, and Tilman is right, focusing on the outcome. The data privacy-friendly solution is better. But if you read this as a question, what's actually happening or what happened there when it comes to interests and opportunities for interest to prevail, this is not an example for the primacy of the political. It's an example for the primacy of the digital capital big players. There was this civil society protest against the centralized solution. That is good, and I'm also in favor of that, and I know that in the context of German operators, this was well received among SAP and T-Systems. It's not without consequences, but none of these companies took the decision. The decision regarding the design of the app was taken by Apple and Google together, because they decide whether they make the app available in the app stores. So it is one of these distorted examples. The result is good. Nobody can seriously say that Google per se is bad. It's of course great that we all have access to information, etc. Although you don't necessarily have to use Google, you could also use Nicosia or other tools. But this is also an example that there is no primacy of the political in this sphere, although people try to describe it in that fashion. Can I briefly come back on that? Coming back to Gaia X, I think it's a good experiment. But for me, this experiment, because large European companies are partnering here. Smells of competition with the US and Russia. It's not about finding a European approach that focuses on the common will, but rather to keep up with the other international players. So I rather have two versions that focus and bank more on competition within civil society, small decentralized projects. Why do we need a huge European cloud provider? The problem is that Amazon Web Services is so dominant. But with respect to monopoly law, we have to intervene and not creating another European giant. Well, but that would have a decentralized structure from day one. Okay, but this is the essential condition because the objective is to avoid any monopoly issues. So we have some big companies controlling their proprietary markets and making the big profit. Now, if we come back to public goods, digital public goods, particularly those made available by private businesses, social media, search engines, etc. Here, the monopoly law should be used in order to create a situation where we have more competition within businesses, among businesses, and between businesses and civil society organizations. I think this is essential. Now, let's have a look at our Twitter questions. I have some other questions too, but I would like to know how this was received on Twitter. Geraldine de Bastion, you looked at Twitter for us. Are there any results that the two gentlemen should maybe refer to? Thank you, Toby, for this very interesting discussion. And of course, Mr. Staab and Tilman, it was also fun listening to you. I'd like to summarize the Twitter questions that have come in so far. So when there are certain clear ideas what could happen regarding alternatives that you just described, there's a question, why is it so difficult from the government angle when it's about good digital offers? Is it money? Is it staff, know-how? What impedes the implementation of these alternatives? Well, I'd spontaneously say we're lacking everything. We're lacking know-how. Nobody can blame anybody, but a lot of people who are in decision-making positions in ministries, for example, belong to the older generation, and they haven't grown up with what we now consider the latest fad in technology. And we're also lacking money. Of course, promotion of research for digital tools and application is great, but it focuses on private businesses. Now, promotion by the public sector for public goods is still lacking. And I come back to what Philipp Staab said. We're also lacking the will to consider technology design the primacy of politics. In economics, we have had this debate. Government should have primacy in economic issues, and this is also a good thing in the corona crisis. We saw that the protection of human rights has priority over economic growth. But in designing technology, people still haven't understood that this is about the primacy of politics and government. I would like to follow up with another question for you. What else has to happen in addition to what you already mentioned so the digital future becomes more sustainable? It wasn't mentioned in the Twitter question, but if we think about European computer centers, cloud infrastructures, should there be rules, for example, that they run on sustainable energy, or are there other ideas how not only the social but also sustainable ecological change can be promoted. Well, thank you for your question. I think it's important to convey an initiative that we started in Germany, networking between the different communities, climate, sustainability policy, and digital policy in civil society takes place on different planets. The Fridays for Future people are completely different from the hacker, chaos, computer club people. Now, bringing these communities together so they can learn from each other. This also applies to politics. DG Connect and DG Environment should cooperate. That's important. So digital transformation is also sustainable transformation. And then, of course, we need specific regulation and incentives and framework conditions that promote digital technologies and embed them into sustainability goals so they can be used for sustainability goals. We discussed, for example, mobility as a service platform that should contribute to the mobility change. A computer center should not only be efficient, but the heat and the waste heat should be made available for heating in times where we have to save energy everywhere. So we could draw up an endless list of potential rules and incentives that can be used so digital hardware and software contributes more to sustainability. Thank you very much. There was another question or a group of questions from Mr. Staab that goes back to Facebook. And it was about democratic responsibility of Facebook and company in this conflict with digital capitalism. It was already discussed in the previous discussion whether there is a loss of democracy if the platforms continue business as usual. But could there also be regulation of the freedom of opinion? This is Carlo's question. I would like to ask a question how these tiered access models could be designed so we don't have regional isolation, but a digital global community instead. And I hand over to you, Toby. Well, thank you, Geraldine. Of course, these are the big questions geopolitically when we talk about digital sovereignty on the one hand, but accept, or to a certain extent, accept this isolation. Philipp Staab, would you like to answer the question about the energy policy perspective or the geopolitical perspective? Yes, I can, of course, answer this question, but I could also contribute to this conversation. I think the bottom-up experiments are very nice, and they should also happen. But I would like to add that you should also think about it from a different perspective. And this is a perspective asking the question, what is the society of the future like, not how it will be built. What experiments do we carry out today so we don't have Amazon but other players in the future? But the question is, what are the challenges in the future? And as a sociologist, I believe that we have an increasing number of corona-like crisis phenomena in the future, phenomena that are stronger than the cyclical economic crisis. They come out of nowhere. All of a sudden, climate change becomes evident with the forest fires, etc. But crisis efficiency would be a demand. And the question is, how do we see to it that the structures that dominate our solutions should not be in the hands of private companies? And that's a completely different question of what alternatives do we build up from the grassroots level. The other question might be even more important. So that's the first answer. Facebook is an interesting phenomenon because what they achieved in the last round of trying to gain control is that they have this public supervisory system completely dismantled because they have voluntary intervention boards, but they don't have any mandate. Now, this is an area which is not part of the Digital Service Act, but it's an area where public governance should be documented without nationalization. That won't happen anyway. But in this sense, this would be an interesting conflict that we could also negotiate in civil society in connection with the Digital Services Act. Now, with respect to the last question, I'm very brief and I'm very open and very blunt. As a social scientist, I think society, from the angle of reality and real processes, I know that society renews itself eventually, and we are already on the path of forming blocks. And Europe is trying to navigate between establishing its own bloc through digital sovereignty. Nobody knows what this is actually about. And on the other hand, it's always about remaining integrated in the multilateral world order. This is the approach the Europeans have to take. This is the thin line we have to walk on. But multilateralism before China, before Trump, will probably not be re-established. I don't think we can return to that. It's not a realistic option. Well, I might add that it might not be realistic, but it's worth fighting for. So we have cosmopolitanism and multilateralism as high values. There are problems that cannot be resolved by going it alone. So multilateral solutions will be needed. But there are other issues too, that, for example, the countries of the global south that were completely left alone with the pandemic should receive healthcare support and financial support. And this can only be done in multilateral agreements and not in blocks. So I would struggle for that. But coming back to your question from Twitter, Geraldine, whether there is this danger of isolation. Well, for me, this goes back to the interview with Shoshana Zuboff, who said what Facebook did not do during the elections in America to control fake news is also a paradigm for the increasing division of the global community into blocks, the rich and the poor, the Chinese versus the Americans or the Europeans. So if this is about the role of digitalization in this division and isolation, we have to talk about the regulation of social media and fake news, because radicalization has to be stopped, and if we want to avoid this process of forming blocks. Well, we're actually going through the roof with our topics. Actually, we're under a wonderful dome here that helps us look into the future. And the question for Philipp Staab also asks what public goods we want to have in the future. How do we get the political primacy back into these public goods? So a final question before we come to the third part of this event starts in the past. What happened? So the public goods that become digital now have been attacked. Is that also due to the performance idea, or the idea of achievement? You can go it alone. You don't need the government. You don't need the state infrastructure. You can make it if you try. That is a typical slogan by both parties in the American election campaign. This is a trend in all large Western countries. Meritocracy, you can go it alone, you can do it alone. Is that the reason why we're discussing about the withdrawal of public goods today? Perhaps because the opposite to performance or meritocracy is the consumer's sovereignty. All players in society have to pull in the same direction, not only politicians. I believe that what it also brought about is the cultural hegemony of a Californian ideology that banks on the individual rather than on government institutions. And this skepticism that you see in a lot of players in our tech community vis-à-vis government regulation, government control, but that you also find in Peter Thiele, who is the spearhead of neoliberalism. And we have to overcome this trend. I think we need a new reconciliation, a new attempt to reconcile individual activities with public activities, and only then these public goods that are provided by public players since Adam Smith can be nurtured and kept alive for the future. That was almost a closing remark. Philipp, do you have anything to add? Well, of course, there is a secular crisis among the citizens. We have learned to define ourselves as consumers that can also make demands vis-à-vis the government, and not so much as citizens who claim their rights. And what's interesting in connection with the corona crisis is that the rights have been stressed more, and the political development of government and the economy can thus be seen from a different angle, and this is a huge opportunity we should not miss. Thank you very much. Public and private cannot always be separated. We saw that increasingly during this discussion, so we should not ignore the limits and the separation between the public and the private, and this is the task of politicians. How politicians can intervene will be analyzed together with Saskia Esken, a co-chair of the Social Democratic Party in Germany. So the topics will also be discussed in the third part of our event. We have to clean up a little bit and rearrange the stage, and then Geraldine will talk with Saskia Esken.